Jocelyn.
And I'm Danny.
And this is Why Can't We Talk About It?
All right, so welcome everyone. This is episode 5 of Why Can't We Talk About It? And for today, the topic we're actually going to be going through is something that I think is a bit more of a personal one for myself in comparison to Jocelyn. And the topic is actually called childhood emotional neglect, or sometimes shortened for CEN. And this is something where I'm going to be talking about it more in regards to my experiences because it's a topic where I did not know was actually a thing until I was in therapy. And to be more specific, it was not even something that I had even known about in the beginnings of doing therapy. Jocelyn, I don't know if I gave the details before, but it's a topic where when I first started doing therapy, there are definitely certain things that I brought up to my therapist where I talked about how, sometimes there are feelings of just like not feeling like alive, a lot of happiness. There's a lot of feelings of emptiness sometimes. And of course, it's something about to do with being passive aggressive. But I worked on a lot of stuff with my therapist. And it just so happened that one day that she happened to kind of bring up this topic and she told me what it was. And I had never heard of it before, but she did actually recommend a book to me. And this book was called Running on Empty. And it discussed this topic called childhood emotional neglect. And it brought up this idea that, I always thought that the way we are as people, the reasons why we go through all these things of why we need to go to therapy, why, people are the way they are, is because of the way things are done to us. So, whether it's events that we dealt with, experiences that we dealt with, or the way our parents treated us when we were growing up, I thought that's the way it shaped who we are. However, this book kind of goes about it in a little bit different way in the sense that it's actually going through about what doesn't happen to us. Does that make sense?
It totally makes sense. And I had never heard about this topic before either until you brought it up. And I was so fascinated. I think this was one of the topics I was most excited for us to discuss on the podcast because it was sort of like, I don't think foundation is the right word for me to use, but it explained so much of why you, Danny, do the things you do. And it explains so much of your behavior. And it made me it changed my perspective and it gave me a new look on perhaps why you do the things you do. Because like I mentioned, I think a few episodes ago, you are very steady Eddie. The way that I would always described you even when we worked together was you go with the flow. Like nothing could rock your boat. Mm-hmm. You just always seemed like, I want to find the right words because I don't want to paint the wrong picture, but it almost seemed like you, not that you didn't care, but like things didn't stress you out. Things couldn't touch you. Like you weren't affected by them. And instead of it being, oh, you don't care and that's why you go with the flow, so much of this stems back to CEN. And I think even you are revisiting this and maybe approaching things a little bit differently now. Was that fair to say?
Yeah, that totally makes sense. And I do agree. It definitely, I want to say it kind of opened my eyes a lot to basically this concept that there are things that don't happen to us that actually ends up shaping the way we are. And, so just so I can get this kind of details out there, the book that I read, again, is called Running on Empty, and it's by I believe, therapist/psychiatrist named Jonice Webb. And, it kind of goes into this topic and it talks about how, it's not so much that children are, in the extreme, like fully neglected. Sometimes she goes, the way she talks about it in this book is just that, sometimes there are parents who they may not be as attuned to their children, especially from an emotional sense, and that because of this, if they're not there for their children enough in an emotional way, there are certain things that end up missing in the children's lives. And when they grow up, there's these things that kind of come back to them as adults. So, just kind of throw some, I guess, types of information out there. It's like things like feelings of emptiness are sometimes, I guess, I want to say symptoms or traits that kind of come up as an adult. There are things such as counter dependence, which I think for me, when I read that, especially myself, is this idea that I actually don't want to rely on people. I feel like I should be able to do everything myself and independent, and I don't want to get help or take help from people. Another thing would be something like unrealistic self-appraisal. So basically the way I view myself is probably different than how other people would view me. So I'm sure that if someone was to ask me, what do my friends think of me? What do family members think of me? It's probably not going to line up necessarily with how I think of myself. Another item will be something like compassion, where you'll have it for others, but you won't have as much for yourself. And of course, there's going to be feelings of guilt and shame in there that kind of grow up with. And this is something that I can definitely attest to, where it's like, this thought of, why does it feel like there's something wrong with me? Why does it feel like everybody else that I know seems like they know what they're doing with their lives? It seems like they all have a plan. It seems like they all know exactly what's going on. Yet for some reason, when I'm just, in my head thinking about it, I go, well, I don't really know what's going on. I don't really have a plan. I feel kind of stuck where I am, and I don't really know how to move forward. And so, and of course, two other things would be, one trait that comes out of it is poor self-discipline. So, for me, it's like I would think, things like procrastination is something that I've dealt with in many ways and many forms. Or I would think of myself and go, yeah, no, I think I'm just kind of lazy. I think that's one way to kind of paint a brush of what that is. And lastly, I think the biggest thing, which I've discovered for myself and through with therapy and through just reading this book too, is that without those nurturing and guidance from my parents in this situation, is that I kind of grow up without a attunement or understanding of emotions. And it's something where I didn't even realize that it was that important until therapy happened and I started going on this journey. And I know this might sound odd to some people, but I didn't really even understand that how people kind of figure out what they want to do, their likes and dislikes, comes from their feelings and emotions, because that part was something where I kind of want to say not only that I struggle with, but I'm not really in tune with that. The part you just brought up, Jocelyn, about how, sometimes people might think, Danny doesn't really care about something, or he doesn't really, feel like making choices. There's that part that I feel like is a bit of a disconnect for me. And so I go, well, it's not so much that I don't necessarily think I don't care. It's that I don't even know what that's supposed to feel like. And that component for the majority of my life, I would say, has been missing. And it's only very recently that I even come to this conclusion where I go, actually, emotions and feelings are pretty important. And it helps to kind of dictate what do you do with your life.
So much of what you just said is fascinating. I can't relate at all. So I find it like I just want to dive in and peel back every single layer. Okay, one thing that you mentioned was that you have skewed self-appraisal, I think you called it?
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, that goes back. It kind of relates to what we talked about last week with feeling like you're a burden, and, that whole, like, even though you know that your friends love you and have told you that they want you to reach out, you can't see why they would feel that way or see you that way. Like they would just see you as interrupting. Like it feels more like you would be an interruption in their day. So that's just one thing I noted. But I think the hardest piece of this for me to try and see your perspective from is the last thing you mentioned, where there's a disconnect almost between your emotions and feelings driving what you want and like how you act. Can you like give an example of what you mean by that?
So I guess when it comes to that, I'll kind of have to go back a little bit further too. It's the way that kind of when I read the book, the way it was kind of described to me, in the way that I, and this is something maybe I'll ask you to once I bring this up, which is given the way I was raised, and I do want to be very specific by saying like I don't think it's something where I'm like blaming anybody. I think it's just like that's the way my childhood was, the way I was raised, is that I didn't really have a lot of guidance or even education in the world of emotions. So I would say even as a child and even now as an adult, I didn't have the words necessarily to name what certain feelings are. So, if I was unhappy about something, or if, let's say, I was sad about something, yeah, I can say those words now, but I think as a kid growing up, those are things that no one really kind of talked to me about. So it kind of made things harder to even express myself. So, I can think of times as a kid where something, I didn't like something, but if someone's like, oh, what's wrong? I would be like, I don't know. I don't know what's wrong. I didn't have the words to explain whether I was sad, unhappy, frustrated, or any of those things. And so I think to come back to your question, like what's an example, it translates into so many aspects where sometimes, someone say, hey, Danny, I guess I used the example last time. It's like, where do you want to go eat? And I'm like, I don't know. I don't really know what I really care for, or I don't know if I really like something or dislike something. So I'm kind of like, hey, you guys can pick. Someone can make a choice because I don't really know. Whereas I imagine for other people, there is this attunement to their feelings where if someone doesn't want something, they'll be like, oh, I know, I feel it. I can tell I don't want something. Or if they do want something, it's the opposite. Where they go, oh, I definitely want something like that. And they'll do that. It kind of comes to choice. And then it comes to explaining feelings. Like I don't have a lot of words to use when it comes to describing feelings. That was a long answer.
No, that's really helpful, actually. And as you speak, I just think back to times like when we used to work together and shit would hit the fan and you'd be so like calm and cool as a cucumber. And I'd like praise you and be like, oh my gosh, Danny, I can't believe how chill you are. I wish I was this chill. And, I think you can be easygoing for sure, but there's a deeper reason why you may act the way that you do in a lot of these situations. And I'm so glad that you're learning about it.
Yeah, it's a learning thing. Actually, let me explain that part a little bit too, because I think I kind of remember people making comments when you and I worked together, but also in different roles. But one thing I remember we did a lot was there were things that were there were deadlines for certain work that we had to do, and I remember that there would be days where people around me, and including yourself, you would kind of express like I guess want to say a little bit of stress, frustration. People would make comments saying, "Oh, Danny, you seem so cool, calm, and collected, even under the pressure of a deadline or a time limit." And I'll say, yeah, I guess just, that's just kind of how I am. But one thing I do want to explain, though, is that's kind of how I look on the outside. But on the inside, I am kind of stressing out. And there are times where I'm like freaking out. I'm like, oh my goodness, this thing's due in 5 minutes. What are we going to do? Can we make it? But I just didn't really understand how to kind of express that without in like a proper way. It just didn't occur to me that like, oh, it's just something that it's expressible. I can see other people doing it. But to me, it's just like, I don't really know what to do here. So then I just kind of keep it to myself and it just stays with me. And so I think that kind of process ends up being where people just kind of see what they see on the outside, which is just nothing from me. But there's all this stuff going on the inside is I I don't really know how to express that. So I think it's a very different thing of what people see versus what's going on internally for myself.
Yeah, I wish that there was some way that I could have checked in or asked, or, is that something that
Well, even if
when
you
you're
did ask
working?
back then, I don't think I would have said anything.
Yes, that's true. That's
Yeah.
that's true.
That may not have done anything to be realistic.
Have you watched the movie Inside Out, the Pixar movie?
I have.
Okay. I feel like, so you know how each little animated character expresses something different, like joy, anger, disgust, sadness,
Yeah.
and fear. I think I named them all. But they also show them like in different situations and how they're reacting. And I feel like what I would be assuming your guys are doing on the inside is just everyone's like chilling on a beach chaise, like let's just chill out here. But really inside, they're kind of like in those scenarios that you just described, they're all sitting at the control panel like, oh my God, just don't touch anything. Just don't touch any of the buttons. We'll get through this by just not expressing anything here.
Yeah, something like that. It's like if let's say, there's those emotions are happening, but they don't know how to like, either it's like don't touch the buttons, or they touch the buttons to show the emotions that the buttons aren't working. Like they're just not going through. And what's funny is my therapist asked me the exact same question too. She's like, have you seen Inside Out when this topic came up? And the funny part about this is I watched that movie the first time when it came out in theaters, and it did not click for me at all. Like there was no, like the movie didn't resonate with me.
Wow.
When it came to emotion, I was like, oh, that's interesting. There's emotions inside. That's cool. And it only made sense to me on a very like logical, intellectual way. There was nothing on an emotional level when I watched that movie where I was like, oh, I totally get it. I was like, I did not get it at all. I was like, oh, this is nice for people. I'm sure there must be people out there who kind of get it. But I was like, oh, it's not for me. I did not have that connection on an emotional sense to that movie at all.
Wow.
And I'm like, oh, okay, well, now I know it makes sense. But at the time, I was like, yeah, I remember being asked, like, oh, what'd you think of the movie? I was like, oh, yeah, that's pretty cool. I guess that's a cool way to like depict what happens with emotions. But I remember thinking just like, oh, I don't really get it. It just it didn't resonate with me at all.
Oh my gosh. Okay, just for some context, and so people understand our friendship a little bit more. As like steady Eddie and easygoing as you are, I think what's so funny about us is that I'm the complete opposite. Like I feel all my feelings very strongly. Azim says, he says I'm a Sith Lord because I only deal in extremes. But if we're going to be using Inside Out as an example, I think all my little characters would be like extreme. They would be larger than life, and they'd all be fighting for control of the buttons because they like are so staunch that like we are disgusted right now. We're not just like, oh, that's a little gross. We're like, that is the most disgusting thing I have ever seen. Or if I'm sad, I'm depressed. I'm so sad. So it's so funny.
Yeah. It is funny, and maybe that's why we're doing this podcast. That's probably what it is. But I remember when I first met you, I want to say probably within the first couple of weeks that I met you, I remember you saying to me very specifically that you said you wear your emotions on your sleeve. And I understand that description, but I don't understand at the same time. In a sense where I'm like, I don't know how people do that. I don't know how people, I don't know if I grew up in a time or in a way where it's like, oh, you have to like have control over feelings. Like if someone was to express a lot, or, let's say they're angry, they lash out, that it was somehow internalized for me that is wrong. That's not the right thing to do. Where, I was maybe, the way I saw it was like, oh, to be better than that, you want to be someone who, yes, even if you don't feel great about something, or even if you are happy about something, you have to kind of keep calm. I don't know. That's a bit of that for myself. So I think I remember you telling me that, and I go, oh, that is a very interesting way for someone to kind of like live their life like that. I guess also at the same time, like, I don't think I know anyone else who's ever said that to me, where they're like, oh yeah, I just kind of wear my emotions on my sleeve, and that's just kind of how I do things. So I found that very interesting as well.
Can we dive in a little bit into CEN and your personal experience? Because you just mentioned that you internalized that if somebody expressed themselves strongly, you learned that that was something that they just shouldn't do. So can you get into that a little bit with a couple of examples that may have led to why the result is that you're not as in touch with your emotions as you could be?
Yeah, I think I can. So this is something where in therapy, I've definitely gone over enough where I can go, oh, I think there's a couple examples I can think of. And as we said before in previous episodes, it just comes down to my childhood. And the examples that I have was that, when I think about myself as a kid, I would say I am the opposite of how you know me and how a lot of people know me. Because I think as an adult, people go, oh, Danny is very calm. He can be very quiet. And he's just kind of like, sometimes like, oh, what is he thinking? Who knows? But I remember there was a time as a kid, up until I want to say around 8 years old, 9 years old, where I was actually very expressive. I was somebody where, I was definitely one to like run around a lot and be very expressive. And I was also someone who I remember watching a lot of kids shows. I would like sing along with it, dance along with it, just that feeling of being very alive as a kid. However, I think there were definitely a couple incidences as a kid where, one example, the one I think probably the most prominent for me is that I remember being on a family road trip where I think, as for a road trip, I was thinking I was 9 years old. I remember my sister was there and she's 5 years younger. And so, two young kids, my parents, and I think we were doing a road trip out east for 2 weeks. And I guess just to kind of entertain the kids, we had a music playing. And I remember that on the way out east for the first week, the mood was definitely more lively in the car. I remember I would sing along to the music and, I would kind of like clap along to the music and so forth. However, I do remember on the way back that the mood was a bit different. I remember when I was still kind of singing along that I don't think the rest of my family was. And I think I was the only one kind of still doing that. And there was one day on the way back where I think I was, just the music was on. I was still singing along. I was kind of clapping. And of course, being a young child, I don't think I really understood what happened. But I remember my dad disciplining me a bit where I was singing and I think he kind of reached around and kind of pinched my leg really, really hard to the point where I remember just being like, I want to say my leg kind of bruised. And I remember just stopping, like everything just kind of stopped for me where I was like, I don't really know what happened. I know I stopped. I can't remember if I cried or not, but it definitely was a shock to me. It was definitely a shock to my system. And I think after that moment, though, I just stopped. Like there was no more singing, no clapping along, no nothing. I just, in that moment, I think I just assumed that I did something wrong. And the only way to understand was that I need to stop whatever it is that I was doing in that moment, which was to be expressive. And I think I internalized that moment a lot because I kind of feel like that was around the start of the time where I just became less expressive overall. And so that's probably like the best example I can give. Now, as an adult, though, I can kind of understand that it wasn't really on me as the kid. It's whatever was happening with my dad in that moment. So that's up to him. But when you're that young, the world is kind of only whatever you know. And so I was like, oh, this is my fault.
Yeah.
The only reason my dad would have done that is because I was being a bad child. And so that was kind of what stuck. And I think that did influence how I was going forward.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. That is so vulnerable. Thank you for sharing that. I think that must have been really hard for you to sort of like look back and uncover that, because it's one of those things that, you just accept that this was a memory I have. This is just like something that happened to me when I was a kid. But, you don't necessarily make that connection that it can affect so much of who you are today without therapy helping you work through it, like literally work through it so that you can maybe untangle some of those beliefs.
Yeah, it's definitely something where I don't think without therapy, and even just more so like my therapist asking me certain questions to make me think about certain events in my life.
Mm-hmm.
So like, for example, the example I just gave is more about the expression portion. And of course, with CEN, I think it's just more about how the fact that there was no explanation given to me at that age of what happened, or any adults checking with me to be like, hey, are you okay, or kind of explaining what happened, because of course I just assumed it was my fault all this time. Even like 3 decades later, I still kind of thought it was my fault.
Right.
And then one of the things with the CEN, which I mentioned, was the whole feelings portion. And so another example, and this is something where I don't want to necessarily just say, oh, it's definitely down to a cultural aspect. However, I do feel like, as someone who's Asian and who immigrated with the family, sometimes, when you're immigrants, you and your parents, maybe, the language, there's a bit of a barrier too. However, I remember a time when I was also probably around that time period of 9, 10, where unfortunately I had a grandparent who passed away. And I think it was one of the first times that's ever kind of been a thing in my life that I experienced where somebody passed away. And I don't really remember, again, having any kind of conversation with anyone about it, or anyone kind of checking in. Like, it just kind of happened. And I remember just like being there for a funeral, and just, I remember the house, the mood changed, but I didn't really understand any of that. I remember we used to have this thing in our house where when it's time for have lunch or to have dinner as a family, we would we in the drawers we had like a bell, and which basically we would ring it, and everybody comes to dinner to the table, and we would have a meal together. And I remember when my grandfather had passed away, I remember one of the first times we were having a meal together, I went to the drawer, I took out that bell, and I started ringing it. And I think my mom was like, "Hey, don't do that. Don't ring the bell." And I remember putting it back in the drawer. I'm like, "But why?" Like, no one, like, it wasn't explained to me why. And looking back now, I would go, "Oh, well, probably because that was my grandfather's bell, and I guess it maybe brings up feelings for people." But I'm like, I didn't know that, and no one's ever explained that to me. And I remember, around that same time, there was one evening where I was in bed, and this is when, like, I think me and my parents were kind of still in the same room, sharing the same room, and I was in my bed, and I can't remember what triggered it, but I was just thinking about my grandfather passing. And I remember it was the first time I kind of thought about the subject of death or dying. And I just started crying. And I remember my mom was reading a book, and she kind of saw me crying, and she put the book away, and she's like, "What's wrong? What happened?" And I said to her, I'm like, "What?" In between crying, I go, "What? But what happens when we die?" And I think my mom was not expecting that kind of a question coming from me, because I actually can't remember what her answer was, but I remember it was so unsatisfactory. I was like, this is not a good answer. This is not helping me at all.
She was like, kid, just let me read this book and go to bed.
Maybe she's like, it's like, well, I don't know what to tell you. But it was things like that where it's like I was clearly dealing with some emotions I didn't know what I was dealing with. I didn't know what it was, and unfortunately, I don't think my mom in this particular case has the tools to help me. And because of that, that's kind of how a lot of things worked in my family and in my childhood. And so growing up, there wasn't much in the realm of feelings and emotions being discussed. And so I don't really know what I felt. Even in that moment, I was like, I was crying, so I assume I didn't like it, but I don't really know what I was feeling and what was going on. So stuff like that is like, without that guidance and even conversation about feelings and emotions, it's one thing to do that as a child, but then once you become an adult, for me, I'm like, oh, there's other things that it affects that I didn't really realize until childhood emotional neglect came as a topic. Right. And so, like I would say to Jocelyn, to you, I would say like, hey, like you said, you probably don't deal with it the same way. So did you have that kind of conversation and education and guidance? Is it the complete opposite of what I'm saying, the way you grew up?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Kind
okay.
of.
Yeah.
Yeah, I can give you a couple examples. I think so. Going back to this being a cultural thing, I think my mom did also struggle with, expressing emotion. There was never any doubt that she cared about me and wanted to, if I did something wrong, she would explain why. But my dad was really the one who always walked me through these hard things, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like depression is a good example of that, although that's a later in life revelation. But I didn't realize that I was depressed until he sort of gently had that conversation with me. And I think in our anxiety episode, I had mentioned, like, I knew that I was depressed, but I didn't know I had anxiety until I went to therapy.
Mm-hmm.
And I only knew that I had depression because my dad walked me through, first of all, our families. It runs in our family, so it's hereditary. And then he was able to so articulately describe what I was going through. He said, I think you're feeling like this. And he was nailing it. And he walked through, why it wasn't my fault that I was feeling that way, the brain chemistry behind it. And he just really helped me understand why I was feeling that way. And then all of these sort of childhood things, like, he either walked me through hard things or he would set an example. So this is like not super related, but the story just comes to mind. So I think I'll walk through it and try to figure out why I think it's related. So when I was really young, I got invited to go to a girl's birthday party. I think I wasn't even friends with this girl. I think it was just one of those situations where she had invited all the girls in the class kind of thing. And when I was really young, I was a tomboy. I think that we don't use that word anymore, but like I just loved playing sports and like wearing shorts. I didn't like wearing dresses. I know that sounds crazy.
Times have changed.
Considering what I'm like now.
Yeah.
Times have changed for me. But I really didn't want to get dressed up to go to this little girl's party. And my dad thought that he was doing the right thing by saying, no, you should dress up. Like, here's a little sundress. Like my mom had laid out like something alternative I could wear. Mm-hmm. And he was insisting that I wear it, I think, because he just wanted to make sure that I felt like I fit in. But I really didn't want to wear it. In the end, I ended up putting on the sundress. And when we went to the birthday party, it was at a gym, like a gymnasium, and it was a gymnastics party. So it was a lot of like doing cartwheels and jumping into the foam pit and all that stuff. And I was the only one who was wearing a sundress. Everybody else was wearing their like sporty gym clothes. And I felt so out of place and so uncomfortable. And it was one of those parties where the parents stayed. And after the party, my dad sat me down and he said, I am so sorry that I told you to do that. What I did was wrong, and I could see that you were uncomfortable. And we never have to do anything like that again. Yeah, he he could see how upset I was. Yes, and he told me I had nothing to be embarrassed about, and he was sorry, and it was his fault for doing that. Because I remember feeling so embarrassed that like if I would do a cartwheel, because they would all encourage me to do it, I was like, everyone can see my underwear. I was like so upset.
Yeah.
And my dad afterwards just sat me down and made me feel like, you know, you did nothing wrong. There's nothing to be embarrassed about. And it's my fault that I made you wear that. So he really, in that moment, modeled for me like how to have a hard conversation, I guess. Mm-hmm. And like it's good to bring these things up and acknowledge shame and taking accountability. Yeah, that's something I wanted to talk about.
Yeah, and follow up is, before you said that he actually, you know, after the party, he actually came up to you and said, oh, you know, he made a mistake in making you go. One of the things that I thought about, I had wanted to ask was, I understand with your mom, there's definitely more of a struggle there with talking about those kind of things. And it sounds like that your dad was more attuned to you. And I guess my question is, was that more of typically that he was attuned to you, so he would kind of approach you to have these kind of conversations, or was it also more like you knew how to go to him to have this kind of talk? Like you knew what to do, or just he made it so that the environment was more open where you can be like, oh, if I need to talk to my dad, I can? Or is it a mix?
I think it was a mix. I think that I've always felt like I can go to my dad or anyone in my family, but very often my dad for these sorts of things, because he created that environment where he, like I said, would model that behavior or come to me and explain something, or like he made the environment a little bit easier for me to come to him with those hard questions like, where do we go when we die? And your story about your grandfather passing away, I think my earliest memory with death was at my great-grandmother's funeral. And my dad was explaining to me that my great-grandmother was going to sleep now, and she was feeling very peaceful, but we weren't going to be able to see her again. And that was why my mom and my apple and my family members were so sad, because that was something I couldn't understand, was like, why is everybody crying? Like you said, the whole mood was sad in your house. I think that for me was the most confusing thing. So he explained to me, this is what has happened to your great-grandmother. Yeah. And it's sad because we won't get to see her anymore. And then he picked me up and let me see her, like in her casket.
Okay.
And I reached out and I remember touching her forehead. And he didn't like get mad at me or like do anything. He just explained, you know, we have to let her rest. She's at peace. So I mean, that's not a super deep explanation, but I was 3 or 4. So.
Right. Okay.
Yeah, I think it at least set me up to like think about it a little bit more and maybe come to my conclusions and have follow-up conversations if I needed to.
The fact that you were 3 or 4, you know, that's always fascinating to me, just like how far back we remember these kinds of things, or like just how far back our memory goes. Because, you know, 3 or 4, it's pretty young. But the fact that that's something you remember even to this day, it's something very profound. And I'm just like, oh, you actually got an explanation? That's amazing. I just compared that to what I went through. I was like,
yeah, I guess it.
You know, it's like, oh, well, you know, just figure it out.
It was an impactful moment for me. I have a lot of really early childhood memories, and I think Something that stands out to me is what you said at the beginning of this episode, which is the impact of things not being done to us, like what the effects of that are, because I never thought about it like that, right? Like I would think about like, oh, we are the way we are because we went through this or somebody did this to us. And when I'm thinking back to my earliest memories, it's because, I had those big kinds of conversations or like those moments stood out to me. But the fact that you're able to recognize, it's that I had an absence of this, I had a lack of this, that explains so much of why you act the way you do. I think that that's just such a deep well that you're trying to get to the bottom of and really work through.
Yeah, and that's something where I think a bit of a goal, I think, for having this conversation today and having this as a topic we talk about for this podcast is actually just to kind of, I want to say, bring awareness. Just the idea that, I always thought we are shaped only by the way things happen to us. So, I think about things that the way people are, I go, oh, if there's someone's in a bad state, it must be because something happened to them where, let's say, if unfortunately there was abuse or something really bad happened, or they grew up in a really bad environment. Those are the only reasons where someone could be shaped that way. But to have it where we're shaped by the absence of certain things, or maybe not 100% absent, but, enough. Like, one of the things that I struggled with for a long time in regards to this topic is I said to my therapist, I'm like, I know my parents love me. I know they care for me. And I think about all the things that they did for me growing up, or even now as an adult. I think about the fact that, they drive me to a friend's house, or they let me go to the park and play. And, they put me in all kinds of like after school activities to try and give me like a leg up or an advantage in life. But when I think about it, going back, sometimes I go, oh, I just kind of wanted my parents to be there on a more emotional level, to have that kind of connection with my parents. And I think that's something where I go, I do feel like the lack of it probably shaped more of who I am today than the other things that were done for me. And I sometimes wonder how much of that is the way a lot of people grew up, where, they have the basic necessities or even just necessities to live their lives, but there's this emotional aspect that is missing. The guidance is missing, or the education is missing. So, I just kind of want to throw that out there. And one big example I wanted to bring up too, in terms of how childhood emotional neglect has affected myself as an adult. So I had a conversation with my mom. This is probably like 10 years ago. I was, I finished school. I was working for a little bit. And I think it was like a year or two after I had started working, full-time job and everything. And I think there's one evening where I said to my mom, we were just kind of, having like a high-level chit-chat where I was like, yeah, work is okay. It's not that great. I mean, I'm still getting paid, but I feel like I kind of want to do something different. I feel like I could do something different, maybe something that could be more fulfilling or more satisfying. And she says to me, well, what do you want to do? And I remember saying to her that, you know what? I don't know. I don't know what I want to do. I have no real sense of any direction of what to do. And my mom said, well, she goes, well, it's going to be hard to do something else if you don't know what you want to do. And I'm like, yeah. And she goes, actually, you've been kind of like this all your life, Danny. You've kind of just wander around. You don't really have any direction. You don't really have any like things where you're like, oh, you want to do stuff. You just kind of wander around and you just do things as they come up. Like I'm very reactive instead of being proactive in life, in this case for work. And I remember at the end of the conversation, I just kind of was kind of self-loathing, where I was like, oh, that's so true. I don't understand why I'm like this. I don't understand why I have no sense of what I want to do. I look around and I see people who, even in school, they're like, oh, I want to do this. Or people who say, look, I definitely want to go in this direction. I want to go in this career. I want to do this for my life as a career. And I say to myself, I'm pretty lost. I really don't know what to do. And now I can go, well, that could possibly be a byproduct of emotional neglect growing up without the guidance in that sense. And so when I was finishing up this book that I mentioned, there was one particular place where the author was just kind of summarizing a few things, and I was like, oh, this part actually I think summarize it for me. So let me just kind of read that part real quick. So this part goes...
Yeah, please.
Yeah, so in the book, this author goes, many emotionally neglected clients have expressed to me a feeling that they are not in control of their own lives, that they go where the tide takes them, and simply try to make the best of wherever they end up. And that was it. And that was the little paragraph, whatever. And I remember reading that and going, that kind of sums up everything that I've kind of talked about this podcast and a lot of the things that I've dealt with.
Yeah, like light bulb moment.
Light bulb moment. And so when I read that, and actually one of the things that this author in the book kind of talks about as a way to, I guess, a solution for all of this is actually becoming more attuned with your emotions. So when I read this part and I go, it talks about kind of wandering and going wherever the tide goes. I kind of imagine myself as I'm on a ship. I am the ship and I'm in the ocean and I don't have a compass. I just literally go wherever the tide takes me. And wherever I do end up, whether that's, for like life events or work, it's just like, yeah, I'll just do whatever there is because I don't have that compass. And I realized since then is that the compass is actually your emotions. People who have emotions, who are tuned to them, they know what they want to do because they can feel it. They know what they like. They know what they don't like. And that's their compass for that ship. And so I realized that if I can work on understanding my feelings and emotions, that will hopefully eventually help me have that compass that will be able to help me guide me in where I want to go. And I think that's something that will be profound for myself as I, move along in life. And so the whole point being is I think there may be people out there, I imagine, who are like this, or as the book tells me, there's definitely a lot of people who grew up in different ways, but the results kind of end up being the same. And so I just hope that if there are anyone who ever hears this, they're like, oh, there is something to look into and more to learn and educate themselves on because it will make a difference in your life.
That is such an incredible analogy. And I think that you are really doing the work of finding that compass to help you. I've noticed such a huge change between Danny 1 year ago and Danny today. So I have no doubt that
Thank you.
The compass will start to work. It's going to start to work. And I think that analogy will also help other people listening who can relate to you. So thank you for sharing.
Yeah, you're welcome. Yeah, very interesting topic. So who knows? We might revisit it another day.
Yeah, that's a good place to wrap and a good thing to mention that we will revisit any topic that listeners can definitely shoot us an email or get in touch and let us know what's resonating because we'd be happy to revisit this. I'm sure Danny has a lot more to dive into, or if there are any ideas for things that you guys would like us to explore, we are open to the feedback.
Yes, we definitely are. Anything you feel like plugging today, Jocelyn?
Just the usual. Just the blog, the newsletter, check out the show notes, and also please subscribe to Why Can't We Talk About It? That really helps us and shows us that you guys like us and we can continue I'm sitting in my closet and trying to record this with my mic stacked on top of shoeboxes.
Very
and
nice.
I would love to keep doing this. So please subscribe and let us know you like it.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, I think that's it for today. So, if anything, hope everyone enjoyed this episode. And we will be moving on to a different topic for next time. Take care, everybody.
Talk to you next time.
All right. Bye.
Bye.